The entrance door of the Poltava City Library slammed with a hollow, echoing thud that rolled through the long, empty halls like distant thunder. Margarita flinched. The old lock had jammed again. She adjusted her glasses and squinted into the dim corridor where the yellow evening light barely reached between tall shelves of dusty books. A tall figure stood in the doorway. It was Gleb. He wore the same dark jacket he always came in, the fabric darkened even more by late October rain. Drops slid from the hood and fell quietly onto the worn wooden floor. His face looked carved from cold stone, pale and unreadable. His gaze did not wander across the hall the way most visitors did. It went straight to the landing desk, as if he had come not for books, but for shelter from the rest of the world. For a moment, Margarita held her breath. Whenever he appeared, the calm rhythm of the day shifted, like air before a storm. "You're later than usual today," she said softly, rising from her chair. "I thought the weather might have stopped you somewhere halfway." Gleb stepped forward without answering at first. He placed a book, wrapped carefully in a thin plastic bag, onto the desk. Only then did he nod. "The rain doesn't stop work when the work can't wait." His voice sounded rough, as though he had not spoken to anyone for days. Margarita noticed his hands while she unwrapped the book. There was dark soil under his fingernails, ground deep into the skin. It looked strange on a man who spent hours studying atlases of rare plants. "Did you manage to find what I asked about?" he continued quietly. "Decorative varieties? The ones planted in the old noble gardens of Poltava region?" Margarita turned and reached for a small stack of papers and a fragile yellowed folder she had taken from the archive that morning. "It wasn't easy," she said, placing it gently before him. "Some pages are almost falling apart, but there are descriptions of several rose varieties believed lost after the revolution." For a few seconds, Gleb looked directly at her. It was such a brief glance that another person might not have noticed, yet Margarita felt as if he were trying to read her thoughts as carefully as he read ancient manuscripts. He took the folder and walked to his usual table in the far corner near the window. Outside, the branches of old chestnut trees pressed against the glass, letting only a thin ribbon of streetlight fall across the pages. Margarita returned to her desk, though she could no longer focus on the catalog cards before her. Life in Poltava had always been slow, almost colorless. She lived with her mother in a small apartment on Levada, listened to the same complaints about money and marriage every evening, and spent her days among quiet shelves. But ever since this silent man began coming to the library, something in that quiet had started to change. The library slowly settled back into silence, the kind that wrapped around every shelf and corridor like a thick blanket of dust and paper. Only the soft ticking of the wall clock and the faint rustle of turning pages broke the stillness. From her desk, Margarita watched Gleb without meaning to. He sat motionless at the far table, the folder open before him. The thin beam of light from the street lamp fell across the pages, illuminating delicate botanical sketches, roses with impossible names written in faded Latin ink. His shoulders were slightly hunched, and every few minutes he leaned closer to the fragile paper, studying it as though each word might disappear if he blinked. There was something unusual about the intensity with which he read. Not academic curiosity, not hobbyist enthusiasm. It looked like survival. Outside, rain continued to fall, tapping gently against the tall windows. The chestnut leaves shivered in the wind, and shadows moved across the ceiling like slow clouds. An hour passed. 2 students whispered briefly near the philosophy section, returned their books, and left. After them came an elderly man searching for newspapers from 1998. By 7 in the evening, the building was nearly empty. Only 2 readers remained, Margarita and the man in the corner. She rose quietly and walked between the shelves, pretending to rearrange returned books. As she passed his table, she noticed the notes he had written in a small notebook beside the folder. The handwriting was careful but uneven, as if written by hands more used to tools than pens. Names of plants filled the page. Rosa gallica officinalis, Rosa damascena poltavica, Rosa alba antiquorum. Next to several entries, he had drawn small circles and arrows, sketching rough shapes of gardens and pathways. "You're mapping something," Margarita said before she realized she had spoken. Hlib lifted his eyes slowly. For a second he seemed almost startled, as if he had forgotten anyone else existed in the room. "Yes. What exactly?" He hesitated, glancing down at the notes again. "A garden." Margarita smiled faintly. "That sounds simple." "It isn't." His voice carried a quiet weight. "This garden existed more than 100 years ago. Some of the roses described here," he tapped the fragile page carefully, "don't officially exist anymore." "Plants don't just vanish," she said. "They do," he replied, "when people forget them." The words hung between them. For a moment, Margarita imagined the place he was talking about, an old estate somewhere outside the city, abandoned paths swallowed by grass, rose bushes growing wild beneath broken fences. "And you're trying to find them again?" she asked. Hlib nodded once. "Or grow them again?" Before she could ask more, the heavy entrance door slammed open again. The noise shattered the calm of the hall. Footsteps echoed loudly across the floor, confident, careless footsteps that did not belong in a place built for whispers. A tall man in an expensive coat strode inside, shaking rain from his hair. Artem. Margarita felt her stomach tighten immediately. She knew that careless grin even before he reached the desk. "Well, well," he said loudly, spreading his arms as if greeting a crowd instead of an empty reading hall. "Still hiding among dusty books, Margarita." His voice bounced off the high ceilings. At the corner table, Hlib slowly closed the old folder. The silence that followed felt different now, tense, fragile, like glass about to crack. Artem's shoes clicked loudly across the wooden floor, each step breaking the fragile quiet of the library. He approached the landing desk as if he owned the building, brushing a drop of rain from his sleeve. "Margarita, honestly," he said with exaggerated disbelief, glancing around the tall, dusty shelves. "How long are you planning to hide in this museum?" Margarita straightened the stack of returned books in front of her, pretending calm she did not feel. "I'm working, Artem." "Working?" He laughed under his breath. "Cataloging relics while the rest of the world moves on." His gaze drifted across the room and stopped at the corner table. Hlib had not moved, but the atmosphere around him felt heavier now, as if the shadows themselves had thickened. Artem tilted his head. "And who's this?" he asked. "A new exhibit?" Margarita felt heat rush to her cheeks. "He's a reader." "A reader?" Artem repeated with theatrical surprise. "They still exist?" He walked toward the corner, ignoring Margarita's warning look. The streetlight fell across Hlib's face as Artyom stopped beside the table. For a moment, neither man spoke. The silence between them felt sharp. Artyom glanced down at the open notebook filled with Latin plant names. "What is this, some kind of herb catalogue?" he said with a smirk. Hlib slowly closed the notebook. "It's research." "Research?" Artyom echoed mockingly. "In a public library?" Hlib finally looked up. His eyes were dark, calm, and strangely steady. "Yes." The simplicity of the answer seemed to irritate Artyom more than any argument could. He leaned one hand on the table. "You know," Artyom continued, "people with real jobs usually don't spend evenings hiding behind dusty bookshelves." From across the room, Margarita stepped closer. "Artyom, that's enough." But he ignored her. "So what do you do?" he asked Hlib. "Professional plant whisperer?" For a second it seemed Hlib might say nothing. Then he spoke quietly. I grow things. Artyom snorted. What, flowers? Yes. The answer came without hesitation. Artyom shook his head, amused. Incredible. Margarita, you found yourself a real intellectual circle. Gleb stood up slowly. He was taller than Artyom had expected. The movement made Artyom straighten instinctively. For the first time, the playful arrogance faded slightly from his face. Gleb closed the folder and slid it carefully into his worn backpack. I'll return the materials next week, he said to Margarita, his voice calm again. Artyom stepped aside as he passed, but his smile returned quickly. Sure, he said lightly. Good luck with your gardening. Gleb walked toward the exit without looking back. When the heavy door closed behind him, the library seemed to exhale. Artyom turned back toward Margarita. You see, he said with a grin, exactly the kind of people you meet when you never leave this place. But Margarita wasn't listening. Through the rain-blurred window, she could see Gleb outside under the street lamp, standing still for a moment before pulling up his hood and disappearing into the dark street. And for reasons she couldn't explain, the library suddenly felt emptier than it had ever felt before. For a long moment, Margarita stood by the window, watching the rain smear the streetlights into trembling golden streaks. Gleb's silhouette had already vanished into the dark, yet she kept staring as if the night might return him. Behind her, Artyom sighed loudly. You're really not going with me, are you? Margarita turned slowly. The fluorescent lamps hummed above the reading hall, casting pale light over the rows of books. No. Artyom spread his hands in disbelief. Margarita, it's Friday evening. Everyone is at the restaurant already. You could spend one normal night with people your age instead of guarding encyclopedias. I'm not guarding anything, she said quietly. I'm finishing my shift. He leaned against the desk, studying her face with a mixture of impatience and curiosity. You know, he said, lowering his voice slightly, sometimes I think you hide here on purpose. Hide from what? From life. The words hung in the air. Margarita did not answer. Instead, she began switching off the lamps above the nearest shelves. Pools of darkness spread slowly through the hall. Artyom watched her for a few seconds, then shrugged. Suit yourself, he muttered, but don't complain later that nothing ever happens in your life. A minute later, the door slammed again as he left. The library fell completely silent. Margarita finished closing the building almost automatically, locking cabinets, checking windows, turning off the last lights. When she stepped outside, the rain had softened into a cold mist that smelled of wet asphalt and fallen leaves. The street was empty. She pulled her coat tighter and started walking toward the bus stop. But instead of turning left toward Levada, her feet slowed near the corner where Gleb had disappeared. She remembered the soil beneath his fingernails, the careful way he had touched the fragile pages, the quiet seriousness in his voice when he spoke about forgotten roses. Plants don't just vanish. They do, when people forget them. For some reason, those words would not leave her mind. The bus arrived with a hiss of brakes. She climbed inside and sat by the window. As the vehicle rattled through the wet streets of Poltava, the city looked unusually distant. Storefront lights glowing behind glass, reflections trembling in puddles, silhouettes moving under umbrellas. At home, the apartment smelled of chamomile tea and television static. Her mother sat on the couch, wrapped in a knitted shawl. "You're late again," Olena Petrovna said without looking away from the screen. Artyom called. Margarita sighed quietly and hung her coat. What did he say this time? That you refused to go out with him. Again. Her mother finally turned toward her. Margarito, he's a good man. He has a position in the city council, a car, connections. Do you think such men wait forever? I'm not asking him to wait. You're 32. I know. The older woman shook her head, disappointed. And instead of building a future, you sit among dusty books and strange visitors. Margarita paused. What visitors? Artem said there's some gloomy man always lurking there now, someone odd. For a moment, Margarita pictured Hlib again, standing under the street lamp with rain dripping from his jacket. He's not odd, she said quietly. Oh, her mother replied. Then what is he? Margarita opened her bag and absent-mindedly took out the small scrap of paper Hlib had forgotten on the desk earlier that evening. On it was a single handwritten note in careful, uneven letters. Rosa Poltavica, possibly surviving near old Dikanka estates. She looked at the words for several seconds. Then she folded the paper carefully and slipped it into her pocket. I don't know yet, she said softly, but for the first time in years, Margarita felt the strange certainty that something in her quiet, predictable life had already begun to change. The next morning, the sky over Poltava was the color of dull tin, heavy with low autumn clouds. Margarita unlocked the library door earlier than usual. The old key scraped inside the stubborn lock, and the sound echoed through the quiet vestibule. Inside, the building still smelled of paper, wood polish, and faint dampness from the rain. She switched on the lights one by one, and the familiar yellow glow spread slowly along the tall rows of books. But today, the silence felt different. She kept glancing toward the corner table near the window, the one where Hlib always sat. His chair remained empty. Margarita tried to concentrate on her work. She sorted returned volumes, stamped library cards, answered 2 routine questions from a pensioner searching for gardening magazines. Yet every time the entrance door creaked or footsteps sounded in the corridor, she looked up instinctively. By noon, he still had not appeared. She told herself it meant nothing. People missed days. Researchers worked elsewhere. Perhaps the rain had turned the countryside roads into mud. Still, the small folded paper in her pocket seemed to burn like a quiet reminder. Rosa Poltavica, possibly surviving near old Dikanka estates. During her lunch break, she unfolded it again. The handwriting looked hurried, but the words were precise. She imagined him standing somewhere among abandoned gardens, digging through thorny bushes, searching for flowers most people believed extinct. The idea felt strangely vivid. As the afternoon stretched on, clouds thickened outside the windows. Wind shook the chestnut branches, scattering yellow leaves across the pavement. Around 4 o'clock, the heavy entrance door finally opened. Margarita's heart jumped before she could stop herself. But it was not Hlib. A woman stepped inside, tall, elegant, dressed in a long beige coat that seemed far too expensive for the old library. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor, each step deliberate. She removed dark sunglasses and looked around with faint irritation, as if the building smelled unpleasant. Margarita approached the desk. "Good afternoon. Can I help you?" The woman studied her for a moment. "I'm looking for someone," she said. Her voice was smooth but cold. "His name is Hlib." Margarita felt the smallest tightening in her chest. "He's a reader here," she answered carefully, "but he hasn't come today." The woman's lips curved into a thin smile that held no warmth. "Yes," she said quietly, "that sounds like him. Disappearing when things become complicated." She stepped closer to the desk and leaned lightly on the polished wood. "You see," she continued, "Hlib has a habit of running away from problems and hiding in strange places." Margarita met her gaze. "And who are you?" The woman took off her gloves slowly, finger by finger. "Inna," she said, "his wife." The word seemed to settle heavily in the quiet room. Margarita felt the silence between the shelves deepen. "He never mentioned the wife," she said before she could stop herself. Inna gave a soft laugh. He probably wouldn't. She walked toward the window and glanced at the empty corner table. He always preferred plants to people, she added. Gardens, flowers, soil, endless sentimental nonsense. Her tone carried open contempt. Margarita folded her hands tightly on the desk. Why are you looking for him? Inna turned back, her expression sharpening slightly. Because, she said calmly, my husband has made a very expensive mistake. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes, and for the first time, Margarita felt a quiet unease creeping into the peaceful world of the library. The wind outside rose suddenly, brushing the chestnut branches against the tall windows with a dry whisper. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Inna walked slowly through the reading hall, her heels striking the floor with quiet precision. She paused beside the corner table where Hlip usually sat and touched the back of the chair with 2 fingers, as if confirming something unpleasant. So this is where he hides, she murmured. Margarita felt an unexpected urge to defend the empty chair. He doesn't hide, she said calmly. He studies here. Inna glanced at the fragile folder lying on the table, the one Margarita had prepared days earlier. The yellowed pages with drawings of old roses peeked from inside. Her lips tightened. Yes, she said. That would be exactly his kind of obsession. She closed the folder without asking and looked directly at Margarita. Tell me something. Did he explain why these flowers matter so much to him? Margarita hesitated. He said they were part of a garden from his family land. Inna laughed quietly, though there was no humor in it. A garden, she repeated. Of course. She walked back toward the desk, removing her coat slowly. You see, my husband used to run a successful landscape design studio in Kiev. Clients with money, real projects, parks, hotels, private estates. Her voice sharpened slightly. Then suddenly he decided none of that mattered anymore. Margarita listened without interrupting. He sold our apartment, Inna continued. Invested everything into a piece of forgotten land near Dikanka, a ruined estate with a half-dead orchard and a few stubborn rose bushes. The words echoed strangely in Margarita's mind. Rosa Poltavica, she said quietly before thinking. Inna's eyes narrowed. So, he has already started telling people his romantic stories. It didn't sound like a story. Inna leaned forward. Listen carefully, she said, lowering her voice. That land is under debt, serious debt. If he doesn't settle it within a month, the bank will take everything. She tapped the folder with one manicured finger. And believe me, they will not care about ancient roses. Margarita felt a quiet heaviness settle in her chest. Why are you telling me this? Inna straightened and put her coat back on. Because he will come here again, she said simply. Men like him always return to the places where they feel safe. Her gaze moved slowly across the tall shelves. When he does, tell him this. If he doesn't sell the land now, he will lose it anyway. And when that happens, even his precious flowers will disappear. She stepped toward the door. For a second, she paused and looked back at Margarita. Tell me, she added thoughtfully, do you believe plants can survive if no one protects them? The question lingered in the air long after she left. The heavy door closed and the library returned to silence. Margarita stood alone beside the empty desk. Outside, leaves spiraled across the pavement, carried by the restless wind. She walked slowly to the corner table and opened the folder again. The fragile pages showed careful botanical drawings, petals, stems, thorns, all labeled in delicate faded ink. Forgotten roses, plants that had survived wars, revolutions, abandoned gardens. She touched the paper lightly. For the first time she understood why Hlib studied them with such fierce attention. because survival itself was fragile. The door creaked suddenly behind her. Margarita turned. Hlib stood in the entrance, his jacket dusty, his hands stained with soil. He looked tired, but there was something brighter in his eyes than before, something like stubborn hope. "I found it," he said quietly. Margarita stepped closer. "The rose?" He nodded once. "It's still alive." Outside, the wind continued to shake the chestnut trees, but inside the quiet library something new had taken root, something neither death nor time would easily erase.